Hello, my name is Father Perrircone. Thank you for being with us again today. I am a professor of philosophy at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, New York. Today we would like to take up a discussion that we began in a previous lecture on the perfections of God. Just to bring you up to date, we had already talked about the fact that human reason by itself can establish that God exists. Now, of course, remembering that we're not speaking about the act of faith here. We're speaking about human reason. And who helps us best in coming to that conclusion but the common doctor of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas. He did that in his classical 5 ways. Oftentimes you might see pictures of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he will be holding up his finger as a sign that he's beginning to talk about those 5 ways of demonstrating God's existence. They are ways that reason can use that does not accept the assumptions of the Catholic faith and still arrive at a certain existence of God. And many people have indeed come to the Church because they first studied St. Thomas's 5 ways to demonstrate God's existence. We could almost say that those 5 ways are perfect. Anyone who's being at least honest and at least open to listen cannot help but be convinced by the airtight, logical arguments of St. Thomas. And all he's asking of his listener is to look at the world, is to look at things. See, you don't have to assume anything with that. Anybody can open up their eyes. That's why these proofs are so salient for any time. Well, we went through each and every one of those 5 ways, his quinque viae. But then we went on to say, well, now that we've established that God exists, let's say something about God himself. Quid sit? What is this being who exists? You might also see depictions of St. Thomas. He'll be holding a book, and sometimes there's a Latin inscription, quid est Deus? What is God? We are told from biographies of St. Thomas that this was a question on the mind of the great saint from the time that he was about 7 years old. What is God? He was haunted by that question. What is God? Well, at the very beginning of his Summa Theologiae, he takes up that question, as usual, with masterful intellectual strokes. So much so, there really isn't any human being, any human thinker who has come close to St. Thomas in examining the problem. Does reason have the ability, after having established that God exists, to be able to say something about God? And he said that is possible, because there is a link between God and ourselves. He exists, we exist. Because he exists, as he has demonstrated in the 5 ways, without limit. He is pure being, pure existence. We, by simple observation, exist in a limited way. You're not the chair you're sitting on. You're not the clock that's ticking. You're not Cynthia, your pet dog that's sitting at your feet. You see, everyone is existing, but limited in their own way. God is unlimited. St. Thomas is also guided in this discussion by that text in Exodus, I am who am, which God tells Moses. He gives Moses this name of his. St. Thomas, when he speaks about what God is, talks about his perfections. Actually, he talks about God's perfections and calls them his names. His names, the things that God is, or his predications, those perfections we can assign to God, having understood, number one, that God is pure being, pure existence without limit. Last time, we spoke about two of these perfections. Simplicity, which is simply another way of saying that God has no parts. Literally, that not only does he have no parts because he's not a body, but he has no part that would limit him to being this thing or that thing. That's not God. He is existence. That's his simplicity, the perfection, or his name, simplicity. His second name is perfection itself, meaning that God is whole. There is nothing that is lacking to him. Nothing that is lacking to him. Interesting question about perfection that we didn't talk about last time. If there is nothing lacking to God, the human intellect in thinking about this might say, well, does that mean that God is everything? No, that's a problem. He is not everything. In philosophy, we call that an error, and it's called the error of pantheism, coming from two Greek words, which means God being in everything, theos. Now, he's not everything. That would be a contradiction. Well, then how is he being? Well, he contains in himself existence that is consonant with his nature. So we can say he has simplicity. Later we're going to say he's infinite. We're going to say he's good. But, and we are able to say those things based upon some things that we see in ourselves. But when applied to God, we recognize that they are infinite in him, where they're finite or limited in us. Well then, for instance, is animal in God? Well, no, it's in God, but he's not an animal. St. Thomas will make a distinction in saying there are actual perfections in God that are things that God is because he is pure being, that are consonant with his nature. But everything that is not consonant with his nature, that is, that everything that is limited in itself, well, for instance, an animal. Animality is something limited in itself because it requires matter. Goodness is not something limited in itself. It can be applied to God and then made infinite. Well, how does animality go with God? Well, Aquinas says that this is a virtual perfection of God. Meaning this, that in virtue of God's power, he makes animals, or rocks, or comets, or flowers. But he's not actually a flower, or a comet, or a rock. You might be cooking supper tonight, or you might be writing a paper. Clearly, that paper that you wrote, the meal that you cooked, it's not you. But it's you in the sense that without you, that is, without the power you exercise to make it, it wouldn't be there. That's similar to what we're talking about here. So, that's God's perfection, and we understand how those perfections fit in God. Today we talk about infinity. Why is God called infinite? That's very simple. We think about the two words infinis, that without limits, that there is no limit in God. So there is literally no end to his being. He is infinite. There simply is no end to the manner in which he exercises his existence. The Gloria, glory be to the Father, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. Intimately connected with God's infinity is his eternity. Eternity is one of those negative perfections. That means God transcends all time. God has no past. God has no future. He's always existing now. Think about it. If his God is unlimited being, if he had a past, as we have pasts, It would mean that there's always something He's not. He's not all those minutes and hours and days and years that have passed, as with us. That's a limit, isn't it? And if He had a future, it would mean there's something that He is yet not. He's not yet tomorrow, as we're not yet tomorrow. That's a limit, isn't it? God stands above all time. He's eternal. Therefore, I will give you the definition that St. Thomas uses to talk about eternity in the Summa Theologiae. He borrows it from a 6th century philosopher, Boethius. And this is how Boethius defines eternity. It is a simultaneous and perfect possession of unlimited life. So, God stands above all time. God is immutable. He is immutable, meaning that He cannot change. Look at what change is. Change is going from something to something else. Change means I am right now sitting, I'm not yet walking. It means I lack something. God lacks nothing. And since He lacks nothing, that there's no limit to His being, He can't change. That might bring up a problem. Say God can't change. Well, what about when I pray and He answers my prayers or doesn't answer my prayers, or for a long time He's not answering our prayers and then He does? Doesn't that mean He's changing His mind? No. It simply means that from our vantage point, it seems as though He's changing His mind. He doesn't change. In point of fact, from all eternity, He knows which prayers will be responded to in which way by Him, and exactly how much time from all eternity a particular prayer is going to require for its answer. It's not that He's sitting and saying, He's prayed enough. Now it's time to change the way I'm going to respond. From all eternity, He knew which prayers are going to take which amount of time in order to be answered. That's why we have to exercise patience and never give up in our prayer, because we do not know when the divine intellect, what He has ordained from all eternity, ultimately our prayers that will be done. His immutability, He never changes. His goodness, because He possesses all being, He doesn't have any defect. Having no defects, He has all goodness. St. Thomas has an interesting line. He says, we know that goodness is in God. We know that God is good. We do not know exactly what goodness is like in God. That's because it's infinite. We can't possibly fathom what infinite goodness must be like. We know it's there. And finally, ubiquity. Ubiquity is that God is everywhere. God is everywhere. St. Thomas borrows something from St. Gregory the Great in explaining God's ubiquity, that God is everywhere. St. Gregory the Great said God is everywhere by virtue of His power, by virtue of His essence, and by virtue of His essence. Essence, power, and causality. God is present, first of all, because of His power that's necessary to keep us in existence at all times. Without God's power, we would not die, we would pass out of existence, we'd cease to exist. He's present in His power. He's present by virtue of the fact that He's caused us to be at all. And finally, He's present in His the power in which He is always knowing us, in His perfect knowledge. So, those are the perfections that St. Thomas sets down for us. That God is pure simplicity. That God is all perfect. That God is infinite. That God is all good. That God is immutable. that God is eternal, and that God is ubiquitous, that He is everywhere. One of those things is God is everywhere where He has created. He's everywhere where there is existence. God is perfectly and fully present to everything, whether it be those molecules that are floating around in your body, the trillions of them. He's present to every one of them because He's present to every aspect of what makes them to be. Every follicle on your hair, every thought that you have. When you have a thought, it's something that's existing. It's existing in your mind, but it's existing nonetheless. He knows it. He knows it perfectly. We can even say that He knows everything that exists, certainly more perfectly than you and I know ourselves. These perfections of God are not simply a philosophical conversation. They even help us in our prayer. They help us to love God more. And that's why I've so enjoyed bringing them to your attention and speaking about them at length in these conversations. God bless you, and pray for me. This is Father John Perrircone. Goodbye.